I'll try and make this fairly quick, but it's going to be a lot of information. I'm also going to send everyone the PDF so you can follow along.
Awesome.
It's about 28 slides or so, and again, you can use this for future reference. You can use this to ask questions. You might see something that you might like and say, wait a minute, hold on, I didn't understand that. Let's get back to this. So everyone has this on their screen?
Mhm.
Beautiful. All right, everybody. My name is Brian Newell. I graduated SUNY Fredonia in the class of 2014. Ended up moving to New York City in 2013. Spent spring semester in 2014 in New York City doing internships from 2014 to 2015. I worked as an intern and assistant engineer over at the Bunker Studios, over at Downtown Studios, Brewery Studios, a couple others. And then in 2015, I had the wonderful opportunity to become Michael Angelakis's studio assistant engineer. So throughout 2015, I kind of helped him out with any studio sorts of needs that he needed. I was there to help him out. Through him, I met Rich Morales of Superfine Audio, and I worked as a mastering assistant for him from 2016 to 2018. And by myself, freelancing, I've worked as a mastering engineer from 2015 to the present. Some of my interests include DIY audio, building outboard gear, the Audio Builders Workshop. We ended up doing a presentation and having a heavy presence the past couple of years over at AES, and I've been trying to assist with that as best as I can. And I've also presented over at the 145th AES Custom Gear Show. That was about 2 years ago. So that's just a little bit about me, a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be talking about the workflow and technique, some techniques of audio mastering. This is going to walk you through everything from getting your files to delivering files, and pretty much everything in between. It's a lot of information, like I said. I'm going to try and explain it as best as I can. If you feel like there's something that you want a little bit more clarification on, let me know. You can either interject, say like, wait, hold on, you didn't talk about that enough, or hold on to it, and we can discuss it after the whole slideshow as well. So there's a couple of things that we're going to get started with. Firstly would be the workflow, and then we're going to discuss techniques that you can use. Again, this is a very broad overview of audio mastering. It's not going to make you a master of mastering in the 1 hour or 2 hours that we'll be here today, but it will give you a very good overview. After these, and we get through the slideshow, we're going to do a mastering demonstration as well, with a track that our very own Nicole had provided for us. Thank you so much. And we'll be listening to that through another link that I'll be passing on a little bit later so we can all take a listen to that. So let's jump right in. The first step with audio mastering is the communication. Someone wants you to master their audio. You are the last person in line before distribution. So you want to make sure that all the needs of the artist and the mixing engineer are covered. So your conversations should include what were some of the difficulties or the troubles that you had with the mix. That way you can take those into consideration for your master. And when you're mastering, you can either address them or listen and say, well, hold on, we should probably go back to the mix. Artistic references and influences will play a huge role in audio mastering. Again, you're taking something that's almost there, or like 99% of the way there, or 95 or 90%, and pushing that all the way to 100%. You want it to be competitive. You want it to be comparable to those artists that you're working with and what they have in mind. You should ask for their delivery format. Some people will want WAV files. Some people will want DDPs. Some people will want CDs. Some people will want master for vinyl. Having that conversation up front, that will allow you to work efficiently and then also provide them with the right format that they need at the very end. And then you also want to ask the direction that you want to see the master go in. Do you want it louder? Do you want it softer? Do you want it more compressed? Do you want it tighter? Do you want it loose? Do you want it a little bit more vibey? All of these things can help point you in the right direction to achieve a master that the artist wants and that everyone will be happy with. You can also establish what is expected and what you can provide. Again, if there's any hesitation with the mixing engineer or with the artist saying, well, I was a little unsure of this, or, you know, we had a really big issue with this snare ringing out, you can, again, take a listen and you can address it, and you can either, again, send it back to the mixing stage where it's more appropriately addressed, or you can take that into consideration with your mastering and go from there. onto the organization. So you've had your communication, you've spoken with the artist, you now are in possession of the files. Once you have everything to go, you've downloaded those files, you want those on a separate hard drive or a work drive. Being organized will be super crucial in order to getting ahead in the game. You don't want to be pulling around different files and saying, oh, wait, this is mix number 3, number 5. Have everything all together in one folder. I usually recommend something along the lines of year, month, date, artist, song, similarly to how you've been taught for recording recitals. You have the year at the very beginning, the months, the dates, and then artist, song in order to figure out which artist, which song, etc. Inside of that folder, you'll have your sources. Those are your mixes that you were sent. You're going to have masters, the masters that you make, the session itself, and then again, anything else that would be additional in order to making the masters. That would be your PQ sheet, your DDP, checksum, anything else like that. When you have the files, check them. Again, you are the last step in the process before distribution. So you want to make sure that everything is in line. They want to make sure that the sample rate is right, the bit depth all the same, that they said, hey, we sent you 10 songs and you only received 8. Hold on, before you say, yeah, I'm going to master it, make sure that you have the right amount of songs. And then you can adjust your template to match. Your sample rate should all match the highest sample rate of the project. And say, for instance, if it was recorded 44.1, 24, that's fine for some mix engineers. And then, oh, wait, we sent it to another guy. He did it at 96, 40 or 96, 32 or something like that. Make sure that they're all the same. It would be better to upsample and work at a higher sample rate, at the top sample rate, than it would be to downsample all the way to 44, 1, 24. Even though that's going to be the final delivery format, always better to upsample than it is to downsample. And now we're going to bring all of those songs, now that it's properly stored, into a template. Similarly to how you would have for a mixing template, this is going to include your routing, your plugins that you're routinely using, export settings, and a good starting point for you to work on your master. Again, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all sort of thing. It's going to be more of a starting point. Again, these are the things that you use day in, day out, the typical chain that you usually have. You can switch it around if you need to, but at least you're not starting from scratch. This template, you can use it in any sort of DAW. For this one, I use Reaper. Again, you can use Logic Pro, you can use Pro Tools. Doesn't really matter, especially if you're just starting out into the world of mastering. There are specific mastering DAWs such as Sequoia. You could use Samplitude, or I believe Wavelab is also pretty popular. But yeah, Reaper works a treat. So what I recommend doing is having your template, all songs in one session in album order, if possible. If the artist doesn't know the album order, that's totally fine too. You can choose to either cascade your songs, like in the first picture at the top, have each song on a different track, and that way you can have your plugin routing chains on different tracks for different songs. So you'll have song number 1 with this effects chain, song number 2 with this effects chain, etc., etc. That works really well if you're going to be working in the box. If you're working out of the box, you can also put all of your songs on one track, and that would be your source track. From there, you would pitch it out of your system, go through your analog chain, and then catch it onto your master track. And you're going to have, no matter which template you choose, whether it's cascading or they're all on the same track, you want to have 3 different tracks to monitor from. Number 1 being the source, which is the mix files that you were given. Number 2 being the master, what you're working on, so that you can hear the difference between the source where you started and then the master where you're going. And then you want to have a reference. And that 3rd track, that reference is going to be kind of your North Star. It's pointing you in the right direction. And we'll get into references a little bit later on throughout the slideshow. Your first step, now that you have it inside of your template, you have it all set up, is quality control and listening. So for your quality control, you have to keep in mind that you are the last person before distribution. Anything that gets through you is probably going to be printed onto thousands of vinyl or CDs or onto their Bandcamp, and people will download it and listen to it. After this, it's pretty much all out for distribution. Any issues you should bring to the attention of the person who can fix them. Usually that's the mix engineer. However, if the artist is also the producer or if there's other roles at play, it might be a group conversation that you guys have. Objective issues that you should bring forward include clicks, pops, noises, things that do not belong, improper cuts, edits, all of these things that would impede the listener's experience or would cause serious issues upon playback. Those issues would be better suited for a mix stage and discuss if you can. I highly recommend having a good relationship, and this kind of turns back to the whole communication aspect of mastering. Get on the same page, have a good conversation with each other. You don't want it to be awkward. Just, again, at the end of the day, everyone wants a good product. So if you can present it in like, hey, I'm really excited about this. I've noticed that there's a couple of issues. There's a cut at about 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The way that you present it and you bring up those objective issues will give a better product, and the mix engineer, the artist, will appreciate it. However, we also run into some things like subjective issues. There's the artistic intent of the song. There's the production, the songwriting, the orchestration. You might think to yourself, oh, well, they used an electric piano. He should have used a Wurlitzer instead of a Rhodes or something. Like, it's not the time to put your producer cap on. You need to worry about the mastering, the quality control. Any production at this point is not up to you. Moving on to differences between EPs and albums and then singles. So more often than not, if you have an EP or an album, you want to start with the loudest track or the one with the most dense arrangement. It's easier to make a quiet song louder, but it's harder to bring a loud mix down. When you start with the loudest point, it gives you a point of reference for the other songs. And basically, by starting at that loudest point, it's all downhill from there. You don't want to start with a quiet song and then make it super duper loud and then realize, hold on, wait a minute, it's still not as loud as the first mix, and then you have to go back to the other one. And so it's easier to start with the loudest, most dense song and work up from there. Constantly reference previously mastered tracks to make sure that they are cohesive. So once you finish that track, you want to go to the next track, maybe the next loudest or the next dense, and again, swap back and forth, make sure that they're still within the same ballpark, that they still sound cohesive throughout the album. Another technique that you can use once you've started finishing up your album and the EP is do the needle drop. A couple seconds from the loudest part of each song, make sure that, okay, we're hitting at the same level. Okay, it still sounds like the same album. Okay, it's all starting to flow together. Your final listen all the way through when you're done, that should be after the needle drop, after you've completed your entire mastering and you've dithered, you've exported, you're ready to hit send on that email. Listen to all the songs one more time, all the way through. Don't take any shortcuts. You want to make sure that you addressed everything that's possible in your master. For a single, very similar to your EP album. And again, if you're starting on an EP or album, you should take this step as well. So set the levels at the loudest section of the song, because if you start with a quiet section, you could easily overload your processors or make judgments that are exacerbated during the chorus, and then it just gets blown out of proportion, or it might disserve the song. And again, you're going to be tweaking back and forth from the quietest to the loudest, and start at the loudest point and then make any sort of minimal tweaks from there. Now we're going to move on to past quality control and listening. We're finally going to get into the meat and potatoes. Now, you've listened to the song. Okay, there's no issues. I don't need to go back to the mix engineer. I don't need to address it. I can finally start work on the master. So your references are going to be, like I mentioned before, the source, the master, and the reference. Source is your mix, master is your master, and then the reference can be a couple of different things. One would be a commercial reference, such as a song by a similar artist. So say, for instance, they really enjoy Tame Impala. That's great. Download their album on HD tracks, pop it into your session, and listen to it from there. Say they don't have an artist that they pulled influence from, but the client or the mix engineer has a limited reference. So they just wanted to get it loud, and they wanted to say, like, this is what's going to sound like kind of when it's done. You can use that to your advantage as well. Most artists are using a limited reference to kind of have a vision of where it's going to go in their head. So if you can get an option with a limiter on the end and then one without the limiter and use that for your master, You can get an idea of where they envisioned it to go and what they're used to, and then also bring it closer to a commercial reference by referencing Tame Impala or whatever they have in mind. If there's no reference provided, they just say, hey, here's a song. I just want you to master it. Do your thing. You can create your own. You can put a limiter on it yourself, or because we're all affluent in music, we have so many different artists that we can pull from ourselves. We might find a band that's similar, or we do a little bit of research about rock flute bands or something like that. All of the references should be as high quality as possible. Try and avoid streaming from Spotify and from iTunes that are going to be lossy formats. If you can, download your references. Go to HD Tracks, or there's a couple other ones, Cubase, I believe. But there's ways that you can find high quality WAV files to compare your song to. And after references, that'll bring us to balance. So as we're looking towards those references and visioning where we want to go with the song, we're going to look into a couple of different things. Mastering is all about balance. If there's anything that you get from this masterclass, is that balance is the most important part. It's not about making it loud. It's not about making a competitive song. It's not about the loud. It's all about balance. So there's a couple different terms that we use, or that I think about whenever I'm mastering a song. It's the frequency balance, the tonal balance, and then there's the dynamic balance of a song. The dynamic balance is then broken down into microdynamics, the crest factor, macro dynamics, and then there's also imaging balance. Your left to your right, your width, your depth, how loud the song is. It's all of these things are taken into consideration. And again, it's a lot of information, but as you start to master and you start doing this more often, it'll be subconscious. It's no longer, okay, I need to focus on the frequency balance, or okay, it's time for the tonal balance. How does this? It all becomes engulfed into one process as you're listening to a song. So firstly, the frequency balance. This is individual issues that you could be resolved in the mix. And this might be something that might be better suited to pass along to the mix engineer. Vocal up, vocal down mixes are usually an option depending on the caliber of the client. What you can do is throughout your analog chain, your vocals might lose a little bit of depth if they're if it's a vocal down mix. So instead, you have a vocal up mix. You're able to pull those out a little bit more, and it's not going to affect the song as much. We also have boominess or harsh vocals, like that ringing snare. It might be easy enough to just notch it out with an EQ, or you might have to say, look, guys, the snare is just out of control. You need to go back to the mix. Anything where you're doing more than 3 dB moves in an equalizer, you should send it back to the mix. You really should. And it's basically too much of one frequency buildup. Take note of it. It might be just a little bit too much, or it might just be not enough. If you can address this first in your mastering process to kind of even things out and get a nice frequency balance. Then you have your tonal balance. Think of this as more of broad strokes. So you've already gotten rid of any of the deficiencies, any of the small things that are causing issue, or like, wait a minute, hold on, that guitar's poking out too much. Okay, now everything's kind of even. Now you start to think about the tonal balance of a song. Think jazz records. It's a little bit more open, airy, but it's also a little bit warmer. It has this low end sort of weight to it, as opposed to an EDM track that's tight and it's aggressive and it's super duper bright. You're going to find a little bit more adjectives such as dark, bright, open, airy, muddy, tubby. And all of these things are going to be ways to describe a broad term of the tonal balance of a song. After your tonal balance comes the dynamic balance. Your microdynamics include the crest factor. Your crest factor is the ratio between your peak and RMS. With a high crest factor, you're going to have a larger difference between the two, and you're only going to be able to push into a limiter so much before you start clipping or hitting that limiter too hard, and it's going to cause distortions and dynamics. Whereas if you have too little of a crest factor, well, then it sounds compressed and it sounds tight and like it's not going anywhere. So that crest factor is something to take into consideration with your microdynamics. Those are your short-term comparisons. Those are going to be instantaneous or more transient dynamics and how those relate to each other. Your macro dynamics, however, are the long-term comparisons. Think between your verse and chorus. If, for instance, there's a verse that's super duper quiet and then your chorus is super duper loud, upon initial listening, you're going to have to take that into consideration. After that comes imaging, your left and right balance. You're going to take a listen. Is the stereo image shifted to the left or to the right? You might need to nudge that left channel up by a couple, like 0.5 dB, depending on how shifted it is. Is the bass centered? Is there too much bass in the left and right channels? If you're going to vinyl, that'll be something that you need to consider as well. Phase issues can occur if the left and the right channels are imbalanced. And not only that, but it will give a weird sort of unsettling feeling to the listener as well. So that kind of falls into your objective issues. If it's something that you can't fix, I would recommend bringing it up to your mix engineer saying, hey, by the way, your right channel is 3 dB louder than your left channel. Do you want me to handle it, or do you want to go back? And usually it'll be like, oh, shoot, sorry about that. If they won't fix it, then it should be easy enough to adjust on your end. Usually it's obvious if it's an artistic intent, such as, you think of the Beatles where you have left, center, right, and everything's hard panned that way. But if there's any doubt, it doesn't hurt to ask. Again, it all comes down to communication. Then we have your width. So in addition to your left and right sides, there's the perceived width between your mono and your side information. So the comparison between technically the sum and the minus channel, sum being your mid, minus being the side. There's the natural width of a song, and some songs are in mono. Older songs that came out in, before stereo was available were strictly in mono. Some songs have a stereo image to them that's a little bit wider than others, and others have a little bit more narrow of an image. But you should always take that into consideration with the references that you have. For instance, if there's an artist that they really enjoy, but pretty much everything is straight up the center, take that in consideration, especially if their mixes are straight up the center. You don't want to say like, wait a minute, hold on, everything needs to be out super duper wide when their intention was a mono or very narrow mix. If you start to mess with imaging a little bit too much, especially width, if you expand the side channels, there's going to be less center information. You're going to lose impact. You're going to lose definition, and it might get a little bit phasey and a little bit weird if you're the listener, because again, there's so much side information going on, it sounds almost unnatural. After width, we have the depth. It's a little bit hard to describe depth. This is considered the space in the mix. Anything that's kind of ear candy, think of this as the separation between instruments, how you can hear into sounds. It's an equal representation of frequencies in the tonal balance. It's not too forward or not too back. Again, it's something that kind of presents itself as the mix develops. You don't want to push a song totally to the forefront that's not meant to. For instance, a nice folk track isn't meant to be super compressed and tight and just in your face, whereas an EDM track that might benefit from being super duper loud, in your face, a little bit more aggressive. So these are things to take into consideration as you are listening to the mix. And let's see, next is references and balance. Excellent. On to loudness and finalization. So you have your balance all set. Your width is looking good, your overall tonal balance, your microdynamics, your macrodynamics, it's sitting in a really good spot. You're like, all right, this sounds really good. Next, you're going to finally bring it up to loudness. Before this, again, you don't need to worry about loudness. You want to get it sounding even. You want it sounding balanced before you start worrying about how loud it should be. For limiting, it handles the peaks, and it's not a replacement for poor production, recording, or mixing, etc. The limiter is really there just to handle the peaks. It does push a little bit more into the loudness, but you're not going to get any sort of loudness if the production isn't there, or if the mix is totally washed out or has a huge dip in the presence range. It's going to be very hard to bring it up into that perceived loudness without, having a proper mix. When you're limiting, make sure to use true peak limiting so that there's no intersample peaks. Again, it's just more of a rule of thumb. Better to do it than not to do it. Handle those true peaks. You'll handle those intersample peaks. and use at least a negative 0.2 dB ceiling. Again, comes back to the inner sample peaks. You might be able to do less, you might be able to do more. And again, by communicating, the artist might want a more dynamic master. They might want something that's optimized for streaming or something like that. And that's fine. Again, this is a service job. You want to serve the artist, you want to serve the song, and you want to make sure that everyone's happy at the end of the day. If that means that they want it a little bit quieter, a little bit more dynamic, so be it. Bring that limiter down, -1, whatever they want it to be, and go from there. If they want it super loud, well, then again, you would have to address that and talk about it with the artist. Now, that also brings me to loudness normalization. Some people will say, oh, well, it needs to be 14 LUFS short term, or long term, the entire album needs to measure to this. Doesn't matter. No two streaming services are alike, and you shouldn't use that as a target. Again, it's there for the listener's enjoyment, not necessarily for you to measure that and say, okay, I need to hit 14, otherwise it's going to be wrong. A good master will sound good no matter what. Doesn't matter if it's on YouTube, Spotify, Tidal, it will translate regardless if it's a good master. Those loudness normalizations are really more or less meant for the user experience, more so than they are for the mastering engineer or for the mixing engineer. That doesn't mean that there isn't, something to learn from that. Your production could benefit from that perceived loudness. If you take a look and you're noticing, oh, wait, hold on, all of my low frequency energy is eating up the headroom, or, hey, wait a minute, hold on, I boosted way too much in the mid-range. It can help point you in the right direction and see where you might need to go back and to address some things, but don't aim for a target just because it's going to be turned down in the end. And again, like it mentions, don't inhibit a good master just to reach a target loudness. And it's something that you would communicate with a client if that is a concern for them. The very, very last part of this process, now that you have the loudness up, that sounds great, it's all balanced, is dithering. If it's already at the desired output format, dither within that session. However, if it's not at the desired output format, export to the correct sample rate, re-import, and then dither in a new session. Now, it's a little bit confusing. If you're strictly going for a digital distribution, such as releasing on iTunes, Spotify, Bandcamp, with no intention to make a vinyl or a CD, totally fine uploading files 9624. That's totally fine. Dither at that sample rate, export it, and most distributors will handle high-res files. And because you've dithered, they'll handle the conversion to AAC, MP3 on their end. However, if you are going to vinyl, or say, for instance, CD, which is 44.116, you would then need to import it into another session if you were working at 96, resample the 44.1, then dither for 16-bit. Again, it all depends on whatever the delivery format is. And again, if you communicate that with your client, what they want, you can take that into consideration for when they are saying, like, look, we need the CD. Great, got you, fam. We have a digital master and a CD master. It's good to go. And again, dither for the desired output, and you only dither once. Since you are adding noise to a signal, even if it's a very, very low-level noise, it really should only be done once. Some people will say, oh, you can dither twice. It's so low, no one will even notice it. Do it only once. Do it right. If you do it only once, you won't need to worry about it in the future. This brings you to the deliverables. More often than not, it's going to be streaming. WAV files, highest sample rate, bit depth, like I said. CDs usually require a DDP, depending on how you're distributing it, or if the artist is doing it themselves. If they're getting it done at a plant, you would probably need to make a DDP, which is a topic for another discussion. And then other upon request, that would be your vinyl, your cassettes, anything like that. This is just a quick overview of most of the deliverables that I've done over the past year. Most of it being, again, streaming, WAV, digital files. That's the way that everyone wants to do it these days. All right, so we've made it through the overview, we've made it through the balance, we've made it through the deliverables. Now it's time to get to the fun part. These are going to be some of the tips that you can use immediately in order to start mastering and to use and put into your toolkit. Again, it's not going to be a definitive list, but it's going to get you into the right sort of mindset to realize, okay, I can use this in order to address this issue with the mix, or I can use this to bring out and enhance something. This is not exhaustive. There's also going to be other tools that we're not going to discuss, such as what's a good one? Distortion, exciters, other things of that, dynamic EQs. We're going to leave those mostly for another topic. For frequencies, low frequency information can eat up headroom. By using a high pass filter, you can gain some headroom, and depending on the filter that you have, you can also gain a nice low end bump. So depending on where you set that, it might be additive, and it might be a nice addition over around 30 hertz, 40 hertz, that not only gets a little bit of a increase at that frequency, but because you're, then feeding into a compressor and then into a limiter, those overtones start to add up, and it gives it a nice, rich sort of sound to it. And that's all just coming from using a high pass filter. My best suggestion is to sort out the low mid information first. All of your instruments are going to be sitting probably around anywhere from 200 to 800 hertz. That first octave contains so much information between your vocals, your keyboards, the overtones of your drums. It all kind of overlaps in that low mid section. If there's any sort of issues, you want to sculpt it out and to kind of figure it out from there. And the top end will usually sort itself out, and the low end, again, is going to be a little bit, you don't have as much stuff going on down there, so it's not as much to worry. So low mid information, get that sitting right first, and then you can move on from there. You can control harsh vocals with a dynamic EQ on the mid channel at the problem frequencies, or you can use a de-esser on the mid channel so it only tackles the vocals. And another technique that isn't discussed so much is feathering. And it's something that I had used with Rich quite often. And what we would do is we would add certain points of interest throughout the frequency spectrum. So basically, you would find a point like, oh, wow, I want to hear more of that synth. It's really, that low end hitting around 220 hertz. Let's give it a 0.5 dB, really narrow Q boost right there. You would find another point of interest around 3K. Those guitars need to come through a little bit more. Again, a very narrow boost, half a dB, if that, at 3K can, add a little bit of something, a little bit of interest. And again, this is after you've done the balance. Broad strokes for adjusting overall tonal balance. You can use a Baxandall EQ, shelves. Again, that's more of getting that tonal balance in order. If the artist wants it a little darker, to tilt it one way. If they want it brighter, the other. And a little tip, 1 kilohertz is going to be audible on any speaker. Does not matter if it's a phone speaker, if it's, a hi-fi system, you will hear 1 kilohertz. So if you want to find a way for something to poke through, 1 kilohertz is a nice little way to kind of, sit around there. You want to tailor that, though. It's not just, 1K, always boost. No, you want to mess around a little bit, make sure that it's sitting in the right spot. So then we move on to dynamics. Compression will add cohesion similar to your bus compressors. You can unlink for character if you have a left-right compressor. You link it for control. You can also keep in mind that ratios are multiplicative. So if you have a bus compressor already and it's sitting like the SSL 4:1, and it's moving the needle at the very end of your mix, and you add another compressor on top of that for mastering, it's now 8:1 compression, everything that's above that certain limit. So it's going to really start to affect how drastic that clamps down on your music. Always start with a slow attack and a fast release. You want the transients to go through. The worst thing would be to have a nice punchy mix, and then all of a sudden you get it to the compressor and you get it all gelling together, but now you've lost that low-end information. You've lost those transients and you lost that detail. So you want to make sure that those are getting through. And then if you need to tighten up a little bit, you can do so. If you over-compress, it can sound tight, constrained, pushed. So use it with caution. More often than not, compression is used as a flavoring tool. With mastering, you'll find different kinds of compressors, VCAs, Varimus, etc., and each one has a different tonal flavor just by passing it through. So again, more often than not, it's just as a flavoring sort of device. You want to tame those dynamics, but it's more or less a flavor. So if you have macro dynamics that are too large, that would be your verse, your chorus, you can automate it. You can also use parallel compression to bring up the lower levels and then down the upper levels so that it narrows the difference between the loudest and the softest parts. And the macro dynamics are too small, so you have a really, really compressed mix. You might be better off bringing it back to the mix engineer, saying, "Hey, take a look at your mix bus. It's a little bit too much. It's overbearing." Or if you can, see if you can get one with or a mix without any mix bus issues or mix bus compression. That might help solve that issue. Then we have your microdynamics. Also, parallel compression can come in handy. If you have a crest factor control on your compressor, you can use that to your advantage. The Tokyo Don's Kotakona, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, I know it. Tokyo Labs, they have a compressor which has a specific crest factor control that is phenomenal. It's reminiscent of the GML 8900, and that's an outboard compressor that is absolutely like the bee's knees. It's amazing at what it does. And that's something that you can also use to your advantage. And, a simple way to do it is clipping. What you'll do is you'll lower the peak, you'll preserve the RMS, and you'll get that crest factor a little bit closer. But keep in mind, when you clip, you're going to be introducing some small amounts of distortion. Make sure that it's inaudible and that you're not hurting the song. And that distortion can add a little bit of grit and aggressiveness as well. If the macro dynamics are too small, you can also use outboard gear to add non-linearities. That's why a lot of mastering engineers use very mute compressors or really, really expensive pieces of gear. The electronics that go into it are military grade and just perfect for what they do. They've spent years of research trying to perfect this piece of audio equipment, and the way that it affects the sound is going to be different than anything that you can find in the box. You can use a transient shaper if you don't happen to have outboard gear. You can also use expansion just in case. But again, those are not an everyday sort of situation. So we're going to move on to imaging after dynamics. Mid-side EQ can give you more control over the spatial elements. You can also add perceived width with a high shelf or Baxenthal styles curve at 20 kilohertz on the side only. And that'll just kind of push a little bit more airiness into your mix, into your master, and open things up ever so slightly. An elliptical filter will, for unruly low end, basically that's summing the mono. It comes back from the days when people would master for vinyl and make sure that the needle wouldn't jump out of the groove. They would use an elliptical filter, but now we know it as like a mono maker where we mono the bass. Use width sparingly. Again, too much is unnatural. It can cause phase issues. You can also enhance the width with mid-side EQ. You don't even need to EQ. You can just use the gain on the side instead if you'd like. And you can also tame wild peaks in the side channels by using mid-side compression. For limiting, don't lean on the limiter too hard for loudness. Like I said, it comes from the mix. It comes from that balance that you achieve beforehand. And you want to lean into the limiter with proper gain staging. If you're finding yourself pulling that threshold all the way down, you're going to be clipping way too much. You're going to be using way too much of that limiter, and you don't want to lean on that for your loudness. You want to find about 3 dB at most for gain reduction. Again, depends on the music. You might be using a little bit more gain reduction than others, but if you're using -3, that's going to put you in the right ballpark. The idea is for this to be inaudible, and you're really only supposed to be catching the peaks. You want to use combinations of clipping, compression, and limiting to achieve more loudness. Some mixes don't need it. They just need a limiter at the end. Put it on, you're good to go. Some other mixes, well, they need a little bit more help. So that way you can use a combination of all of those. Pay close attention to the low end impact, because as you start to limit, it'll chop off those transients. One of the first things to go is that low end, because your kick drum is going to be probably one of the most peaking elements in your song. So as that gets hit into the limiter or into compressors, you want to make sure that you're not losing that impact in the low end. Again, true peak ceiling, output to preference. Dithering, always dither, always last. Dither for the end format. And like my mentor has said, it's either the least important or the most important part of the process. What does that mean? Basically, you don't even think about it. You do it, you get it done, it's out of the way, don't need to worry about it. Or you might run into a client that's trying to ask for 0.2 dB revisions, or, oh wait, how does this sound with this compressor instead of this one when they're both in bypass? It can turn into a very hi-fi debate very, very quickly. So the best thing that you can do is always to make sure to put the dither on, and then if it becomes an issue, you can start to get a little bit more nerdy with it. And then just in general, there's gain staging. Make sure proper gain staging, not just for recording, but also throughout the mastering process. If you mono the master and then flip the phase, you can listen to the out of phase material. So as you're limiting, that is going to produce any of those crackles or those distortions that might be imparted into the master. Your idea is to serve the song, not the meters. Do not use your meters as a target. It's only there so that you don't totally go off the road. You're supposed to use your ears and not be looking at a screen this entire time. You need to feel the music, and you need to understand the direction that the artist wants you to go. You can always turn a good master down, but you can't always turn a dynamic okay master up. And again, this comes back to hitting those targets. If you make a good master, it's going to translate everywhere, no matter what. However, if you shoot for 14 LUFS and, well, it sounds okay, yeah, you made it dynamic, but it could have sounded a lot better if you approached it in the right way. Keep in mind that a little bit goes a long way, not only the multiplication of the ratios, but also since you're adding 0.5 dB across the entire spectrum, across the entire instrument range at a certain frequency, it's going to add up as you stack it into a compressor, as you stack it into limiting. Constantly reference, that's the biggest one right there, is to take a listen to your influences, different artists and whatnot, and to make sure that what you're doing pushes the song in the right direction. And last but not least, if it sounds good, it is good. It's said by Dave Fridman, Bob Katz, myself, etc. There's a reason why if it sounds good, it sounds good. Use your ears more than anything else. And with that, we're done with part one. Anybody have any questions, comments, concerns?
Yeah, I have a couple. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure thing. Go ahead, Graham.
Cool. So, well, I guess the one I was kind of thinking is like, how's this quarantine thing affecting everything for you? Are you still like getting good work and doing enough stuff, or have you seen like a decrease in activity? Or
That's a good question. For me, I've seen pretty much a steady influx of clients, of work coming in. I've also kind of realized, well, not everyone has money for music at this point, especially in the recording arts. A lot of musicians have either side gigs in order to afford their music careers, or the ones that are recording are coming up with songs now because of social distancing. So I'm expecting a little bit less, and it's kind of started to take a little bit of a downturn. But once things start to open up a little bit more, there's going to be more music created. There's going to be more need for recording sessions and more mastering sessions as well. All right. Any other questions before we start the demonstration? Going once? Going twice? Great. All right. I'm going to get out of this one. All right. And we're going to take a look into the session. There we go. Okay. So like I had mentioned before, we have the source at the top, the master in the middle, and the reference at the bottom. The reference, unfortunately, nothing from iTunes at the moment. And just wanted to show that you can create your own reference just in case. So we have Ozone on that one. And again, we just use Master Assistant, came up with some nice handy dandy presets for us. We'll take a listen to that later. First things first, we're going to take a listen to the mix. We're going to go towards the last part of the chorus right over here, one of the louder sections, just to get an idea of what this song sounds like. All right, so we took a quick listen right there. Some things that I had noticed on that first listen, and as I was mastering the song, it could widen up a little bit. It's a little bit narrow, and it's totally cool. We have a little bit of stereo elements going on. We've got the keyboard doing a nice panning sort of thing. We also have some vocals moving around. It'd be nice to hear a little bit more of that on the side. We also have the bass. My God, I love the bass. It's phenomenal, and especially with the references that Nicole had provided. Sounds very similar to Wolfpack or There was the second one, Coyote. I forget what it was called.
Hiatus Coyote.
Hiatus Coyote. That's the one. So very, very similar. And again, I want that bass to be heard. It's there, but it's being kind of dominated by that kick drum. It's very peaky. It's present. It's punchy, which is great. But we just need to kind of bring that back just a little bit more, just to kind of set it in. Vocals are nice. They're sitting in a good spot. I just wish there was a little bit more of them. I want to bring them up in the mix, in the master, get them a little bit more present, a little bit more noticeable, a little bit more forward. Overall, we want that slight lift on the top end to give it that nice sheen, but it's still relatively dark when you compare it to, again, it's not going to be pop EDM or anything like that, but it's also not going to be super jazz on the dark end of the scale. So instead, we want it to be more focused in the low mids, and we can bring some of that information out on the side channels in order to give it that weight and to give it a little bit more groove. In the mid-range, and again, using those references, we're going to go back. So into the session, we're going to go into the effects chain that I have here, starting with the Bax EQ. What I had started with is a simple cut on the low end. Everything above 24 hertz is staying. Congrats, you are not the weakest link. Because we have a little bit more room to work with, increase the gain by about a dB so that we could feed into the mid-side EQ. So with this one, like I had mentioned before, we're going to start with the mid section and then talk about the stereo section over here. It could be a little bit wider. So we did end up opening it up a little bit with the stereo width, kind of bring out that side information. The low end, I love it. So we wanted to raise it right around where the bass was hitting, around 120 hertz. And it's just going to be a low shelf to bring that up ever so slightly. And again, I'm emphasizing that very, 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 very tiny amount at 105 just to give it that little push where the bass is sitting. Again, like a 0.5 dB bump. That nice low mid-range, you'll notice 330 hertz on the side and in the center. That's going to be where your low end of the guitars are strumming, where that keyboard is hitting. And I wanted to hear more of that. So we gave it a little bit of a broad boost. And again, only about a dB or so. Nothing in the upper mids that sorted itself out. I brought the vocals up in the mid channel by starting a very, very a shelf at the very, very low frequencies around like 4K, just to give it a little bit of a lift. On the side, again, I really, really wanted a little bit more low information to give it that weight, to give it that groove. So we're copying the 120 hertz over here, the 330. Nothing in the middle. A little bit more on the upper mid-range. I wanted a little bit more bite from those horns. And then again, also on that side. Real quick recap. Bax EQ, using it only for the cut. No gain, no shelves or anything like that. For the equalizer, we're just pushing a little bit more gain into the mid-side EQ. Okay, cool. I can kind of see what's going on. Like I can almost see responses. We're going to put this over here just in case. Okay, great. So we have this to kind of recap real quick in the midsection. Want that bass. I love that bass. We need a little bit more of that bass. We got that shelf going on. Again, a little bit goes a long way. Half a dB here, half a dB at the very bottom end of that bass, like right around 100 where it's starting to get a little bit meaty. 330, love that low mid information. I need more of it for the keys and for the guitars. So those got a nice 1 dB boost. And then the shelf for the vocals around 4K, 1 dB there. Stereo width, a little bit more, 130, nothing too super duper crazy. But we wanted to make sure that it's just a little bit more. And then we have the side channel over here. So, okay, we're going to do a quick out and then in. We're going to do out first. Just a little bit, just a tiny little bit to kind of get that balance where I want it to be, to exacerbate some sort of areas, those low mid sitting where I want it to, and it gives it a little bit more life. It gives it a little bit more energy, which is super duper cool. Next, we're going to move on to the compressor. Like I said, it's mostly for flavor. With this, I wanted to, I don't want to bring anything down. I decided to use a little bit of parallel compression to give it a little bit more of a volume boost. I also used, okay, we're going to walk through here. Threshold, self-explanatory, attack all the way to the, hold on. Nicole, do you have the audio movers link? Great.
Yep, I got it.
Sweet, thank you. The attack all the way over to the slowest setting, the release all the way over to the fastest setting. Ratio is 1.5. Again, a very small ratio. Then we have something fun going on, since what I basically did was get a balance sitting where I want it to. We now have the Nouveau filter of the Elysia, which is basically just a tilt EQ. It's only tilting a dB towards the top end. Since we're already, again, I boosted a lot in the low mids. I love the low mids, but we want to make sure that we get that sheen as well. So everything above 150 hertz is getting pushed, and then the bass is only getting slightly dipped down. The mix, again, just parallel compressing just a little bit around, where's 66? It was supposed to be 66.6, but whatever. It's close enough for the moment. Gain, 4 dB. And we also have a little bit of soft clipping going on. So the soft clip, like I had mentioned before, that kick drum was really poking. It was nice. It was punchy. It was present. But it was just a little bit too much in comparison to the rest of the track. So what we're going to do is we're going to do another listen through. And we're going to do out and then in. It's going to be an overall volume increase, but also notice the excitement. It kind of picks up and gives it a little bit more life in the upper range. And also notice the clipping. It should give a little bit of distortion, but not a lot. Again, it's going to be very subtle. Let's take a listen. Awesome. I don't know about you, but it makes me want to get funky. So it just gave it a little bit more life, a little bit more of a boost, a little bit more volume, and got it closer to where we want it to be. Awesome. On to the next. So we have the EQ first to kind of sort out any balances. Then we have the compressor to bring the level to where we want it to be. Again, as we're feeding that EQ into the compressor, it's squishing things down, but it's bringing it to the same balance that we want it to be. This is a phenomenal EQ. It is a model of the Sontec 432. You can find it in every mastering studio, basically, and it sounds amazing. It's a very warm very warm EQ. It has its own analog goodness to it. Even the plugin itself kind of replicates that. However, with this, I wanted to create points of interest, and this is the feathering that I was talking about before. You'll notice that the Q setting is very tight. So it's going to be very narrow boosts. We have one at 50 hertz, and that's going to be pushing whatever I pulled down on the compressor. So it's going to give it a little bit more push on the bass. It's going to give it a little bit more of an oomph on the kick drum. And again, we're only doing half a dB there. And then we have, bam, look at that, 1K, looking great. Another very narrow boost. 1 dB there to give a little bit more presence, and then some sparkle on the top at 12K. Whoop, at 12K, there we go. And again, only about a dB right there to kind of add a little bit more air on the top. So once again, we're going to do in and then out. It's also 3 dB louder, so I'm going to turn that down. Again, I only pulled up the 3 dB because I like the output gain stage on this. And I wanted to feed it into the limiter that we have going on. So I'm going to turn that down, do about 1, and we'll do an in, out real quick. Here's out and then in. Sweet. So just gives it a little bit more vibe, a little bit more character, a little bit more. Again, it's kind of giving it a little bit more life. You can use Ozone, you can use a sort of other processor, but the other thing about mastering is that you need to give it a life. You need to give it some sort of feeling to it, because if the artist's intent isn't being delivered at the end of the day, then you're not doing your job. You have to balance it. Yes, you have to get it ready for distribution. Yes, but you should also have some fun with it. Make sure that it's exciting, that it's cool to listen to. And that's where I really, really love this plugin, is because it just adds that sort of je ne sais quoi that you're looking for. Last but not least, we have Ozone 9. And again, it's just a limiter. You can use whatever limiter that you would like. True peak, so that we handle the intersample peaks right here. Negative 0.2 for the ceiling, so that we don't go over by too much. We're using a fairly fast attack and release, and that's going to be pretty standard no matter what. However, that's more to taste. Same thing with compressors. You're going to be working with program material. This one warranted a more fast attack and release. Stereo independence, keep it about the same. These two I'm not terribly fond of. However, it seemed to work at around 20% for this song. You'll notice as I start playing that it's only catching the peaks, and you can see the amount of gain reduction going on over here. Again, we'll take a listen to before, and then we'll do an after. Again, it's going to be a little bit louder since we are doing some limiting. Here we go. Funky with you. Ooh, funky with you. Funky with you. Awesome. So that completes our mastering chain. We're going to do a quick before and after of what the mix sounds like without any of the processing, and then we'll do one with the processing. So this is the mix, and then we're going to hop right over to the master. Awesome. And that's basically it. Again, it's all a lot of small movements. It's a lot of small adjustments, but it all adds up to something really, really big at the end. Again, we followed the balancing beforehand, got it sitting where we wanted it to, added a little bit more excitement, and then by using the limiting, put it up to where it needs to be. It'll be around negative 10 LUFS or so, so it might be turned down if you were to listen to it, say on Spotify. However, when you compare it to other references such as Wolfpack and whatnot, it's going to be sitting right along both of them, both sonically, loudness, perceived loudness, all that good stuff. So the other fun thing about this is that I'll be including or sending a download link to Nicole as well. You'll get the mix and the master that I've done for your listening pleasure, as well as the PDF of the presentation. But that's pretty much all that I have for now. Does anybody have any questions?
Nope, Graham here again. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. Yeah, I had to switch off of my phone. My phone died partway through, so I'm on my computer now. But I was kind of wondering, like, do you have like a specific genre that you tend to focus on, or do other mastering engineers tend to be genre focused, or do you all kind of do everything?
We do everything. There have been times where I've had children's choirs that need to be mastered. I've also done German death rap, and everything in between, basically. So yeah. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. I think that's about it for now. Like I said, I'll be sending the PDF over to Nicole, and as well as the mix and master. Expect those later tonight from me to her, for her to you whenever, I guess. So yeah, that's all I got for now.
Thank you so much for doing this. It was great.
Awesome.
Hey,
Yeah,
you're
thanks,
both
man.
welcome.
Thank
You're
you.
both welcome. You're welcome. And again, if you guys ever have any questions, On the PDF, there's my website, my email as well. Feel free to reach out at any time. Again, I'm here to help as much as possible. And I know that the SRT base is super duper tight. You guys come down to AES or to New York City for AES. And yeah, I'm sure I'll be seeing you guys in the future.